How did you came about being, if I may call you a strategy coach, strategy consultant? How did this all came about? What led to this?
So, well, after a very sort of unsuccessful corporate career, which involved getting essentially fired from both EY and L'Oreal, I went into the sort of marketing agency world, and I was, just like a sort of junior account executive. And But it was a good environment because it was like a sort of smallish business, 50 people maybe, and so very open-minded to trying new stuff, sort of entrepreneurial in that way. And so it was very much the kind of place where you could sort of propose to the boss, well, why don't we do this? And probably they would basically say yes, if it didn't cost any money anyway. Uh, and uh, as you know, a lot of sort of agencies do have a strategy function, but this agency didn't. And I knew, I wasn't even aware that such a thing existed, let alone did I know anything about it. But I don't know how it came up, but over time, I got wind of the fact that some sort of bigger agencies did strategy, which basically means a rationalization of the campaign work of the idea that they're coming up with. So long story short, I said to the boss, "Oh, why don't we set up a strategy department and I could run it, and there's nothing to lose for them." So he's like, "Yeah, fine." So I did that, just completely making it up as I went along. I had no background or education or knowledge whatsoever in this field, but we just sort of muddled through with it, and it was really effective for the agency. It improved. Whether or not it actually improved the work, I'm not entirely sure, but it certainly improved the win ratio for the pitches because it's you're giving good reason for the ideas that you're putting on the table. And by and by, I came to realize that ultimately what any marketing agency of any type is really doing is they're putting lipstick on the pig, right? They're taking a client business which isn't necessarily the best thing ever, which is probably flawed in various ways, and you're trying to put a positive spin on it and make it attractive to people. That's ultimately what the game is, and that's a lot of fun. But you are it did make me think, well, like every now and then you'll get a business that comes along where the agency has to do very, very little creative or insightful thinking in order to sell that product. Because whatever that business is just so bloody great in and of itself that it doesn't require any creative trickery to get people to want it. So, a stereotypical example, like, it's not very difficult if your client is IKEA or Red Bull or something like that, right? That's a bloody easy client to have, and actually probably quite a boring client to have because, in a sense, you are not. They know what they're doing, so the agency doesn't have the capacity to do any big leaps in order to sell that product or to sell that brand. So I was like, wow, it would be really cool to actually help the flawed businesses become more like those businesses instead of just, dressing them up nicely with nice ads and whatever else. So that's how I got interested in what you would call company strategy, let's say, as opposed to simply comms strategy, which is basically what you're doing in an agency. Like, how can you turn those? How can, instead of putting lipstick on the pig, how can you work on the pig itself? Uh, so I was then just kind of, again, it's not a field that I had like advertising strategy. It's not a field I had any exposure to. It's not a field I had any knowledge in. I didn't have any, kind of um, education or sort of mentoring in this space. I just developed my own theories on it. And oh, here's what really great businesses do, which are different than what all the really shit businesses do. So basically, that's the thing that I need to go and then tell people to do, which is pretty much as simple as that. And then I went out there on my own with my sort of company, so to speak, i.e., just me, Basic Arts, and tried to sell those ideas to businesses. And by and by, gradually, I managed to uh, get the odd client and sort of do the process with them reasonably successfully. Uh, and then the next thing that you notice in that game when you're selling pure strategy work is that, and this comes on to I think your sort of area of interest as well, is that, as you said, most businesses, they don't have any strategy at all. And the reason they don't have any strategy is because it doesn't even cross their mind. They don't know what they don't have. It's an unknown unknown and all of that. So that means that when you're selling strategy work, it's very difficult because nobody's shopping for strategy work. It's not like branding, let's say, where everybody knows, oh, I need a brand, and they go in out there and they go shopping for a logo or however they do it. You're selling something that nobody wants because nobody knows that it's missing from their business. So that then means that if you want to sell pure strategy work, and if you look out there, you'll see there are very, very, very few people or organizations selling pure strategy work because the market size is minuscule because no one wants it. So the only way that you can sell it is through education. You have to say to businesses, this is what strategy is, essentially. And then the business reads that, and then they're like, oh, I don't do that. I don't have that. And then they might be interested in buying from you. But without that education piece, no one's going to be interested in buying from you because they have no idea what it is that you're selling. So that then pushed my business in the direction of, my marketing is necessarily extremely educational by because it's the only way that I could possibly ever sell anything. Because you can only generate interest in the product by first of all generating awareness that the concept and the problem even exists. So that's obviously then led me to writing the book and doing all the LinkedIn stuff, because all of that stuff fundamentally is just me trying to make people realize they have a problem. And by God, do they all have a problem? As I'm sure you're aware, but they have a problem that they are completely unconscious of. Hence, why then this being my kind of business model.
Alex, so the classical Harvard Business Review definition of strategy is points of differentiation from competition that you can preserve. And I mean, it happens through annual static planning. They all get together and it's strategy creation, top down. What's your views on it? What different approach do you have? How do you advise your clients differently? Because that definitely does not work.
Well, I mean, in some sense, like all that sort of classical Harvard Business Review stuff, it is actually on a theoretical level, I can't fault it, and I actually agree with it sort of entirely because I don't believe that there is in terms of substance, I don't believe there's any difference between what I do and what any other strategy person does, because strategy isn't something where you as a sort of as a thought leader or a business, you don't invent what strategy is or how to do it. What it is actually this static, unchanging thing, which once you understand it, like it is completely immovable, and all that stuff about points of differentiation that you can preserve, like you said there, like I have no disagreements with that. The issue and the way that I do things differently is nothing to do with what you're trying to achieve or what strategy is. It is purely about the means by which you get people to understand it, develop it, and engage with it. And the problem with the sort of traditional strategy world, I mean, there's a number of problems with it. Firstly, it isn't really a problem for a certain type of organization. Like if you're a multinational corporation that's got an army of MBAs and and they all know their stuff and you can do all of that process. Look, I don't necessarily think it's the best process in the world, but the fact of the matter is that they know what it is and they try and do it. So respect for that. That is good. That works. The issue is for any business that's below 500 million turnover, something like that, i.e., a sort of non-multinational corporate. For whatever reason, it's not that they do it badly, it's that they don't do it at all. And the reason that they don't do it at all is because the way that it's presented and described in that Harvard world, um, it it's not sticky. It doesn't resonate with people. It sort of goes in one ear and out the other. And ultimately, people interpret it wrongly as being just sort of management gobbledygook. And so, which it isn't, all the stuff that they're talking about is great. But if you're not hiring McKinsey, you don't actually have access to that type of thinking. So the alternative to that type of thinking is just no thinking at all, right? Which is what they basically do. So you're either shell and you are probably doing some really solid formal strategy work, or you're another business and you're just doing nothing. So I'm like, there has to be something in between here. All of the principles that the formal, expensive Harvard strategy work is talking about are sound and true, and they apply to every single business on the planet, not just a big one. They apply to you selling friendship bracelets out of your bedroom kind of thing. The dynamics are the same. But the question is, how can we talk about that and do it in a way where you don't have to be in the Harvard McKinsey universe to play the game? So firstly, this comes down to articulation. So talking about it in a language which is more accessible and sort of interesting fundamentally. So like I say, that you take that definition you gave there, I've got no issue with that definition, other than the fact that it doesn't really other than the fact that basically it's dry. So if instead, one way that I tend to talk about it to people now is I tend to say, right, so what is strategy, right? You basically need to find a way to sell something that people want, but that they cannot get anywhere else. That's the riddle. If you solve that riddle, then basically you're going to make money automatically and you've won the game of business, okay? Sell something that people want, but that they can't get anywhere else. Almost no business out there manages to solve that riddle. And that's why they have all the problems that an average business faces with, lack of demand, competitive pressures, blah, 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 all the stuff that, all the day-to-day stuff. So when you can say to any business at any scale, listen, that's fundamentally all you need to do. That's all there is to it. That is all there is to it. Instantly, when you say that, any business person is going to be like, oh, well, yeah, of course, right? So suddenly you've made the problem accessible. Now I've actually got something I can get my teeth into, something that I can attack. Then, then you have the question of how do you do that? And again, that's another question of accessibility, because I think there's this perception that the process maybe requires a lot of data, maybe it requires people with qualifications, credentials, maybe it requires a lot of time, maybe it requires a lot of resources, maybe it requires people to be very, very smart, maybe it requires all these things that I, as a, and we're not even talking about, a tiny business, I, as a mere $200 million business, I can't do all of that. But then you say to them, well, listen, it's an absolute fact that a strategy you come up with in 6 minutes has the potential to be better than a strategy you come up with in 6 months. I'm not saying it necessarily will be, but this is completely possible, because all any of these strategies ever are, and I don't care who you are and what professor you are or how many millions you're charging from a big consultancy or whatever, when all is said and done, this is just a person taking a punt and saying, well, maybe if you do this, it'll work, right? There is no strategy which doesn't fall into that category, okay? And again, when you recognize this, which is just a fundamental truth, then you see that, oh, okay, well, yes, it would be nice to throw $2 million at this over the course of 2 years, but I don't have to do it that way. I could just, and I'm not proposing that this is the optimal way of doing it, but I could just get drunk and throw some ideas at the wall and say, oh, I like that one, let's give that a go. That is a strategy as much as anything else is a strategy, right? So when you then open up that sort of like that democratic possibility within the field, people then have something that they can try. So obviously there's a lot more to it than this, but these two basic things of like the way that you describe it, and then opening up the potential for it being approached in an informal, not resource intensive manner. Already you're halfway there to letting people really embrace the discipline. And just to round that up, one of the things that I like to say is that strategy is an amateur sport. The greatest strategists in history were not people who had quote unquote qualifications in strategy. Like, to use the most stereotypical example possible, Steve Jobs did not know what he was doing, right? He just like was very bloody, he was very smart, obviously, but he was just a very opinionated, stubborn person who just did basically what he thought was right. And as it turns out, he sort of was right. So like if Steve Jobs can basically like create the most valuable company the world has ever known, to all intents and purposes, on the back of a napkin, I'm not saying that this is how you should do it, or that you are necessarily as fundamentally talented as Steve Jobs, but it does illustrate the fact that ultimately this is a very informal discipline. And it's an informal approach which does not have a hard set of parameters around the process that you should pursue.
Alex, what I would like to know from you as well is speaking about our clients. Now, the common issue, once they have decided what a strategy is and they've created one, then it's down to the execution part. Now, often it's a mindset issue as well, because the mindset that you created a strategy with often differs from those that have to execute, especially when it's handed down. And then those who have to execute raise their hands and they go, well, we want to understand the strategy. And then that's viewed as resistance to change. So often strategy causes conflict within an organization, the way it's traditionally dealt with. I would just like to hear your views on that. Because, okay, my opinion is that strategy is best when it's co-created. And of course, I mean, it sounds oversimplistic, but if everybody has a voice in an organization, as opposed to it's created from the top, handed down, now we have to execute, but we don't even understand it.
So I certainly do agree with that. But there are so many other bits as well that people don't incorporate into the process to overcome these issues, which you can incorporate. So in addition to what you said, so firstly, this is one other way that I perhaps depart from sort of strategy orthodoxy, which is that I see the first responsibility of strategy not to be necessarily to be right or to even be a good idea. Of course, that's important and nice, but the first responsibility is actually it's the motivational tool. So it's something that gets people pumped up, because think about it logically, a strategy that nobody executes, it doesn't matter how clever it is, it's useless. So therefore, the first thing a strategy must do is pave its own way to execution, which means not only be understood, obviously, and be clear, but also to be motivational and exciting. So a big issue where a lot of this sort of like quote unquote resistance to strategy comes, not putting too fine a point on it, from the strategy being boring. And if the strategy is boring and not sort of like sexy, then firstly, that's a clue, ironically, that it won't work, because sort of a strategy being sort of sexy and charismatic is actually a clue that it has a meaningful, penetrative insight within it, which therefore will obviously drive effectiveness. but it also makes it charismatic and exciting for people to do. So firstly, like, the strategy needs to somehow be fun and get the blood pumping. So that's something that people are first of all going to have an issue with. And how many strategies are like that? Vanishingly few. And then the means by which you disseminate the strategy as well is quite important. It's, I don't think that, although I do agree that if it's co-created, it's better. I don't think that if you don't co-create it, it's going to kill it. But you do just then need to be very thoughtful about the way that you share it. So in addition to being a motivational tool, strategy is obviously also a leadership tool. Strategy and leadership are very, very closely intertwined. And this is a kind of important point, because I think that people think of strategy more as a management tool than a leadership tool. And management and leadership are not the same thing. Management is obviously about, like, how can we sort of make the machine operate effectively and efficiently. But leadership has a slightly more kind of human and sort of esoteric dimension of kind of selling the vision and getting people moving and being understood and kind of making people feel happy to work in the organization and bringing everyone with you and making everyone be aligned and all of this other stuff, which isn't really, in my view, a management thing. So strategy is part of that. And so you need to think very carefully about the way that you actually present the strategy in a way that's appropriate for the audience who is receiving it. And so to give you one very basic example, I believe that all strategy, you should have a what I call the strategy document, which is obviously sort of a piece of paper where you write down what the strategy is. And the strategy needs to be written not as a statement of, like, okay, here's the thing we're going to do. Obviously, that's part of it. But actually, really, you should think of strategy more as an argument, whereby the document is basically like an argument for why we're going to do this thing. So you can read it, few paragraphs on a sheet of A4 from beginning to end. And those few paragraphs, you could give that to anybody, not just in the organization, but outside of the organization. They could read it and they'll be like, oh, right. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, let's do that. Right. Because it's not just, here's what we're going to do, a kind of like an executive order. It is you're making a case, right? I like to think of it as, like, in like a TV legal drama, when the lawyer is giving their closing arguments to the jury, and they're sort of like, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you must find our client not guilty or whatever. It's exactly the same thing. Picture yourself as a lawyer, write down that argument, like, where you're saying, well, because of this, this, and this, we've realized this, which means that if we do this, this is going to happen, right? You owe it to people not to tell them what the strategy is, but to arm them with the argument for the strategy. And those are those are very different things. So I see a lot of people, they're not arming their people with an argument. And the other beauty of arming them with an argument is that way people can basically make it their own. So even if they haven't co-created it, if I explain to you, as people always do, if I just explain to you, I don't know, what the strategy of Tesla is or something like that. Now, I wasn't in the room when that happened. I don't know exactly how it went down, but I can sketch for you the general idea of the strategy, and you'll remember that sketch, and then you'll internalize it, and then you'll be able to take that and you'll be able to tell it to other people with that. And you won't be, not because you memorized verbatim what I said, but because you understand the argument, you understand the case. And once you understand the case, then you're away. And that's the problem that a lot of these organizations have, that, like, well, frankly, they don't have an argument in the first place is their first issue, so they can't do this. But then even if they do, they just say to people, all right, so here's what we're going to do. And, like, that's not enough. No, you've got to, bringing people with you does not necessarily mean getting them to come up with a strategy, but it means having them own the story, having them own the narrative, so that they can then go to their mates in the pub and say, so this is quite a cool thing that our company's doing because of blah, 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 we dot, 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 and off you go. So that's a really underutilized technique, I think.
Brilliant. And I would like to ask, where should somebody start? Because in the beginning, it was, let's call it a frightening discovery to learn that so few companies understand strategy or know where they want to head or have clarity of vision. Where should we start when we know nothing of strategy? What is the starting point? Where
So there are lots of potential ones, obviously. So let me think about what would be the optimal. Um, Assuming that this is a already established business that's already, making money and making sales, not like a startup. The good news is that I think that the strategy is always actually, it's not something you have to create. It's more like something you have to find. It's always latent in the business, assuming that the business is reasonably successful. It's always latent in the business as it is. So you need to take the viewpoint that like this business is already doing something very, very strategic, because as evidenced by the fact that it's making some money and it has some traction. But the founder, we, the leadership team, do not know what that thing is. That is the general pattern that you'll find, that like the real point of leverage that a business has is something which is sort of accidental and which you are doing already, which is working well, but you aren't really doing it on purpose. And then generally speaking, the process flow for strategy development is you find out the thing that's already giving you leverage, and then you sort of double down on it and you start doing it very, very aggressively. So that's the kind of good news, that you don't really need to start kind of blank sheet of paper, blue sky thinking. What you need to do is, and there'll be there's more to it than this almost always, but I think that the first most basic question you can ask is, right, well, what really works about this business from the point of view of the market, not from my point of view as the chief exec or the founder, because that's completely distorted and frankly blind. I like to say that, the founder is the one person on the whole planet who knows the least about their business, because they're the one person on the whole planet who has never seen their business from the outside. So, they're the last person in some senses who should be judging. Uh, so so that's the first sort of like point of inquiry that you would have. The other, I think, very important point of inquiry is, you need to shift your thinking, and this is always a problem for unstrategic businesses. You need to shift your thinking from a mindset of being better than your competitors to a mindset of being different to your competitors. That sounds like a throwaway line that's very easy to say, but I don't think that people realize quite how extreme a statement that is. Almost every business out there, they're very focused on beating their competition by being better than them. And you'll always hear people say, oh, well, yeah, we're better than so-and-so, we're better than so-and-so. You need to get into your head that better, as far as the market is concerned, is a synonym for the same. Every time you say we're better than Joe Blogs, what the market is hearing is we are the same as Joe Blogs. And you are driving commodification of yourself whenever you say that. Instead, your mindset needs to be, all of our competitors are just as good as us. And on many metrics, they're much, much better than us. And that there are people out there who really should go to our competitors, who would be much better served by them than by us. We are no better than our competitors. All we are is a company that offers something distinct from our competitors, which is this thing. And then the question becomes, well, what is that thing that you offer distinct? And of course, the answer invariably is nothing yet, because you haven't actually figured it out. You haven't developed a strategy. But as soon as you divorce yourself from this obsession with better, then you can start to see things much, much more clearly. You can start to see the true dynamics of the market and the true nature of your business. So yeah, I think those are the two good starting points: uncovering the leverage that is already in the business, and stopping, getting yourself out of the headspace of trying to be better than your competition, and just accepting that there is no such thing as better.
That makes me think about blue ocean strategy. Is that what you essentially speaking about? Removing yourself from the red ocean of competition, so to speak?
Yes, although I want to just hark back to the thing that I said earlier on, which is that there is no new theory of strategy that it's possible to come up with. There is only new language. So it's tempting to think of something like blue ocean strategy as a new sort of like thesis on how a business wins. But it isn't. It's a new explanation of what already existed,
Yeah.
right? So yes, I 1000% subscribe to everything that Blue Ocean Strategy says, but that's not because, I mean, Blue Ocean Strategy is great and it's a great articulation of a principle. It's amazing articulation of a principle. But Blue Ocean Strategy is not new knowledge. It's just a clever way of articulating old knowledge. So not only do I subscribe to what Blue Ocean Strategy says, I subscribe to what every single bloody strategy book ever written says. Well, probably some of them are actually complete garbage, but for every sort of like famous one, because in my view, they are saying exactly the same thing. There is no gap, in my view, between Michael Porter, who is probably the strategy sort of guru, so to speak, that I have taken the most from. There's no gap between Michael Porter and Blue Ocean Strategy. It's the same game, just described in a different way. So yeah, but I do think that, yeah, to answer your question, definitionally, strategy and good business in general is the process of finding a blue ocean. Now, maybe the slight flaw, not flaw, but the slight no, yeah, maybe the slight flaw with blue ocean strategy is that it implies, when people think of oceans, they think of this like colossally, because it's an ocean, they think it's this very big thing, this very big space. And it's very intimidating to think, how could we possibly come up with a blue ocean? But the truth is, it could actually be a blue puddle. That would actually be fine to create a very, very successful business. So if we look at, like, I don't know, Patagonia, let's say, like, Patagonia is a very strategically strong, very successful, very powerful business. Now, but ultimately, Patagonia, they make outdoor clothing. There's no universe in which we could say that they occupy a blue ocean in a very pure sense. But they have an angle and an approach in outdoor clothing which does give them huge competitive advantage. So in essence, they have sort of found a blue patch within a red ocean, if that makes sense. So part of the problem with the blue ocean, red ocean stuff is that I think that it makes what you need to achieve sound bigger than it really is. I think we would all be more than happy to be running Red Bull or Patagonia or IKEA, all businesses that actually exist within supposed red oceans, but have managed to find competitive leverage nonetheless.